what I said last time is that we're not talking about who's oldest. That's not relevant. What's relevant is, did you survive under conditions that you should have disappeared? If you survived under conditions that you should have disappeared, then we'll need some explanations to why you survived and didn't disappear. Even though I think we could make a justified claim that we're older than any other functioning human culture, but that's not necessarily my case. And we divided Jewish survival into two periods. From King David to the end of the Second Temple, which is about 1,000 years. I said we're starting there because it's a compromise with Jewish historians. Some credit the tradition going back to the patriarchs. And by the way, maybe I shouldn't use the word Jewish historians. These are historians of the Jewish people, many of whom are Christians. But they do it on the basis of the archaeology. And there was a radical group that made the whole of Judaism start with the Maccabees. So King David is more or less in between. Of course, that second group is fading because archaeology has been very unkind to them. But anyway, so I'm picking King David because a solid percentage of historians believe that King David was a real person. That gives you 1,000 years. That's the ancient period. Then from the end of the Second Temple to the present, which is approximately 2,000 years, is the second period, which I won't call modern, just not to sound crazy, but the second period. Now, first thing we have to do is detail what about the period has to be explained. What are the relevant facts? Then we can take the particular explanations that have been offered and test them against the evidence and see whether they fit. I did say something last time. I usually leave it to the end. I'm remembering now, I said it before. Let's say I'm successful. I show you that Jewish survival can't be explained by any of the current suggested explanations. A natural response, I would say it's almost universal, is to say, well, wait a while. Why jump to something radically new? Give us another couple 100 years and maybe some bright guy will think of something, or gal. Don't want to be sexist about it. And we'll get an explanation in old terms. Isn't that the scientific thing to do, the philosophical thing to do, the intellectual thing to do? Don't jump to conclusions, but wait and see whether an explanation will be forthcoming without a radical new change in your point of view. And to that I said, no, that's not always the scientific, rational, reasonable, intellectual thing to do. There are many cases where discoveries were made which broke the old paradigms. And people didn't say, let's wait 200 years and see if somebody thinks up an explanation. What they said was, the old paradigm is wrong and we have to create a new paradigm. That's what they said. I gave two examples. The nuclear force, when they started to discover the inner structure of the atom, and they realized that there's a nucleus with electrons in the vicinity, and the nucleus itself isn't a single thing. The first model was it's made of protons, just protons sitting together. Now protons have electromagnetic charge, and they're all charged positive. And like charges repel. At that time, there were recognized only two static forces. One was electromagnetism, and the other is gravity. Those are the only two forces that aren't just something bumping against something else. Gravity is much too weak to overcome electromagnetic repulsion. So they said, we've discovered a new force, the nuclear force, which is much, much more powerful than, in a certain way anyway, than electromagnetism. Nobody said, don't be so rash. Why are you jumping to conclusions? Let's wait a couple 100 years. Maybe someone will figure out how gravity can do it. No, they didn't say that. Gravity's too weak and this is too strong and it's not going to work, so let's get something else. It isn't always the right thing to do. Wait and see if we'll figure it out. Same thing's true with Freud's introduction of the unconscious. People do lots and lots of things. It's hard to explain why they do those things. Freud said people have unconscious desires and unconscious beliefs, and that's what they're acting on. For many people, that was like saying, people live in square circles. I mean, you believe something, but you don't know that you believe it. You want something, but you don't know that you want it. And Freud said yes. And he created some scenarios where he could give plausible explanations as to why people did what they did. People didn't say, look, this is a radical new departure from the way we think about human beings, the way we think about the world. Let's wait a couple hundred years and see if somebody explains this stuff without your radical new departure. They didn't say that. What they said was, we're having trouble. We don't seem to be making progress. People have been doing this stuff for a long time. We don't have an answer to it. So we'll accept your picture of how it works. So not always is the right move to say, let's wait a couple hundred years and see if we can figure it out. So if I really do succeed in showing you that the explanations that have been offered are woefully inadequate, that will be a good reason, I'll explain in detail, it can be a good reason for saying we have to recognize something new. In particular, we have to recognize divine providence. That's the name of the game. So now we started, I think that's more or less clear unless people have trouble with it. Now we started with a review of the facts to be explained. That's the first thing you need to do. By the way, the method I'm using is child's play. Describe the facts that have to be explained, look at an explanation, see if they fit, and if they don't fit, reject the explanation. I mean, that ought to be obvious to 7-year-olds. I testify to you in all the reading that I did from Jewish historians, not one adopts that policy. Not one. Not one. What they do is they say, here's Jewish history. Now, what about that? Wouldn't that do it? Sure. Doesn't that feel good? You know, doesn't give you an addition, does it? That's it. That's the answer. A systematic comparison of this proposed explanation with the facts is never undertaken. I, coming from philosophy of science and mathematics, was a little shocked. But I don't know. They've got their discipline. They do things in a different way. But for me, if you want to show that you have an explanation, match it up with the evidence that you're trying to explain bit by bit and show that the explanation works. If you don't do that, you haven't done the job. Yeah.
Do the scientists know how the nuclear energy works? How it keeps the protons inside the atom?
Well, sort of. According to quantum mechanics, forces are mediated by exchange particles. And there are gluons, which are exchange particles, and they've calculated their size and their effect, and they can give you a consistent picture of how it works. Consistent picture. But then, okay, it's a long story. I mean, I can give you books to read about it, which Frank Wilczek has written a number of books of which I've just read too, and I'm very impressed. You can get a lot of accounts of it. At any rate, so we started with the ancient period, and we said that you have about 1,000 years where almost all of it, we have our own country, our own king, our own economy, our own army. We're affected by larger powers, that's true. If you think Israel is independent today, you have a pretty good picture. We can't just do what we please when America says no, so we negotiate and so forth and so on. But we have our own economy and our own police force and our own army and our own population, our own borders. And during that period of time, the beliefs of the Jewish people are absolutely unique. Now, I describe what I mean by absolutely unique in the following way. There are two different ways something can be unique. A thing can be unique in a way that everything else is unique, like your fingerprints. You have unique fingerprints. Even identical twins have the same fingerprints. But you're unique that way, and so is everybody else unique that way. Each one of us has unique fingerprints. On the other hand, if George was born with 2 livers, that would be news, because everybody else has 1 liver. He's unique with respect to something else that everybody's the same. That's a much more striking element of uniqueness. That needs a much more special explanation than simply fingerprints. Judaism in the ancient period is unique in the second sense. Ideas, beliefs, values that other cultures share, they are identical on. Judaism disagrees. And that needs some kind of explanation. And I gave some examples. Monotheism. There's no monotheism in the ancient world generally, and certainly not in our region. And if you tell this to somebody, and he's very clever and he thinks of himself as very well educated, he may tell you that there was a pharaoh of Egypt who, during his lifetime, the only god that the Egyptians worshipped was the sun. When he died, they were so, how shall I say, disturbed, and they abhorred his ideas, and they broke his temples, and they erased it. But he did exhibit, so they say, well, you have here, the Jews were in Egypt, and in Egypt itself, you had a period of monotheism, a few decades. One careful historian points out that that's strictly not correct because although they worshipped only the sun, that emperor didn't give up on his own divine status. Oh no, there were two, the sun and him. Not one, two. And it had no residue. It never again appeared in Egyptian history. It was never revived. So to say that that's what kept the Jewish people alive for 1,000 years, living in an entire area where everybody was polytheist, is grasping at straws. Number two, all the gods of the pantheons of the area have physical form. Most of them are like people. Some are like animals. The only belief system that denies physical form to God is the Jewish belief system. Number three, the Jewish sources describe God as morally perfect. The other religious pantheons have no truck with that idea at all. The gods have no claim whatsoever to any kind of moral standing. As I mentioned to you, Zeus became the chief Greek god by murdering his father. And that's fine. The gods, that's fine. No problem. And they kill each other. They form coalitions against one another and lie and cheat and endless. And there's no complaint about it. It's not regarded as a demerit in any way. Then the idea of all power. So, of course, if you have a lot of gods, no one of them is all powerful. And some, like the Greeks, recognize that the gods in toto weren't all powerful. There's something called fate, which even the gods can't overcome. The Torah is consistent throughout that God has all power. Another element is, I'm telling you things, I'm telling you the truth. You might not like this, but that's the way it goes. All ancient religions were open-minded and tolerant. None but one was exclusive. I say it's sort of like Los Angeles. You do your thing, and I'll do my thing, and everybody's happy. There are no religious wars. One historian goes through 1,000 years of ancient history with no religious wars. There's nothing to fight about. If you live in Babylon and you visit Egypt, you'll offer a sacrifice to the Egyptian gods because they're real. They're just as real as your gods, and vice versa. The only ancient religion to say that its picture of the world is a true picture, and all the other pictures are not true pictures, is Judaism. Fifth, which I didn't mention, or fifth or sixth, I can't keep track anymore. I didn't mention this last time, but I'm telling it to you, as I said, whether you like it or you don't like it. Every ancient civilization practiced some form of homosexuality. This is in a book called The Construction of Homosexuality, published by University of Chicago Press. This book has 100 pages of references. I've never seen a book like that. 100 pages of references. And this guy surveyed all ancient cultures. Every ancient culture practices some form of homosexuality except for Judaism. So when people tell you homosexuality is the latest thing and latest equality and the newest thinking, it's very ancient. Now here's again the place where Judaism stood against the whole world. So you have here elements of Judaism that disagree with what everybody else agreed on. That has to be explained. Now, if we existed in some isolated South Sea island someplace where we didn't really contact with other people, then it wouldn't be so difficult to explain. That's the way we evolved. That's the positions we arrived at, and we just kept them. But we were, as the cliche has it, the crossroads of three continents. Every major conqueror in this area marched to our backyard. The Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, they all came through we were in contact with everybody, and we remained different from everybody else. You can push that point a little harder. Why is it that all the other nations agreed on these things? Well, in our region, there are two things working together. This is what historians say. First of all, people live under roughly similar circumstances. Life, death, pleasure, pain, times of plenty, times of starvation, war, peace, victory in war, losing war, disease, health. These are constants in the human condition. Cultures rub shoulders with one another, and there's a homogenizing effect on the cultures. But that makes it harder to understand why our culture became and remained absolutely unique in the way that we described. And I also said that there's another way in which you could artificially preserve the identity, the existence of a religion, and that is if your culture has some kind of successes, non-religious, which carry it, give it fame, give it power and money and the rest, and the religion is carried along. It's just a way of identifying with the empire so that you can be part of that very juicy pie. People pledged allegiance to the Roman religion for 300 years because they were running the world. It paid. So if you ask how come the Roman religion existed for 300 years, the answer is it was the religion of an empire. The success of the empire carried the religion. But if you look at that ancient period of 1,000 years and you ask what secular success, non-religious success did the Jewish people have over that 1,000 years, which could carry the religion along as a secondary effect, the answer is none. We didn't have famous mathematics or ceramics or agriculture or military skill or economics or architecture. We just didn't have it. All we had was our unique religion. So that's not going to explain it. So it needs some kind of explanation. The final point that I made about the ancient period was that there were experiments. Not always was the Jewish practice uniform. Jews are creative. Jews are also independent. The biblical term for it is stiff-necked. They tend to do their own thing. And so in the first temple period, there were Jewish idol worshippers, polytheists. Now, I didn't say this last time, but I want to insert this now because just for the sake of understanding. When we say there were Jews who were polytheists, the modern mind thinks in terms of either or. Either you're a monotheist or a polytheist. Either you believe in the Jewish tradition or you believe in something else. In the ancient world, it wasn't that way. In fact, it has been dignified with its own special term, the term called syncretism, 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 where it means that you combine elements of different cultures, of different traditions, and you make your own amalgamation, translated to plain English, hodgepodge, your own cholent, your own mess. Now, for example, there was a period where the Jewish king instituted idol worship in the temple. That doesn't mean he forgot about the Jewish God, the creator of the universe. No, he had sacrifices to the Jewish God together with the sacrifices to the idols. During that period of time, the temple was called Beis Hashem, the house of, and now comes the Hebrew proper name of the Jewish God. They didn't change the name of it because they went over to polytheism. No. It was the Jewish God plus Baal plus Ashtart and, a little this, a little that. On Mondays and Thursdays this, and on Wednesdays that, and every third Thursday of the 7th month, you do that. It was combinations. So the Jewish polytheists of the ancient world, first temple period, it isn't as if they turned in their identity card as a Jew. No, I'm a Jew, but from time to time I give sacrifices to Baal and others, and I participate in the rites of various other religions, and I do the whole thing. That existed for hundreds of years. The prophets prophesy against that, inveigh against that. There's contests against them. When idol worship in general died out, Jewish idol worship died out as well. That form of Jewish expression simply disappeared. In the Second Temple period, you had the Hellenistic period. This country was very strongly affected by Greece. Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek schools, athletic contests. They even developed some kind of medical procedure to erase or dull the sign of circumcision, because if you were circumcised, you were considered to be blemished, and you couldn't compete. And these Jews wanted to compete, so they underwent some kind of procedure where the sign of circumcision would be dulled, so that it wouldn't be noticed, and therefore they could compete in the games. You had a Hellenistic Jewish practice. We have fragments of a Passover Haggadah in Greek for people for whom Hebrew was just not an option because they were speaking Greek. Greek was spoken here. I don't say everybody forgot Hebrew. There were always people who kept the continuity, but there were people who practiced a Hellenized type of Judaism. When Hellenism in general disappeared, Jewish Hellenism also disappeared. That's going to be important in terms of understanding explanations for Jewish survival. Those are the features of the ancient period. Okay, we're together so far. That was more or less a summary with a few extra points. Now, what about the second period, the last 2,000 years? So here you have the Jewish people scattered as small minorities within majority cultures, and a substantial variety of majority cultures. You have on the Arabian Peninsula before the rise of Islam, before the 7th century, you have what everybody, including the later Muslims, called barbaric Arabic cults, polytheists and what we would call barely civilized and so on and so on. Then from the 7th century on, you have Islam, which within a century conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. Don't be too impressed. The size of the Arabian Peninsula on a map is as big as Europe, but it's almost all desert. People live in a few oases, they live along the seashore, but at any rate, they conquered the whole thing, and they ruled the whole thing in North Africa. Then Jews were under Rome. Then Rome became Christian, which is what we call Catholic at that time. So you have small minorities under the control of large majorities. And the large majorities were militarily powerful, often economically very successful, and in some cases, philosophically and scientifically very advanced. The medieval Muslims were very advanced. They translated Aristotle into Arabic, and they had a large part of his corpus, and they discussed and debated it in very sophisticated terms. They did significant work in mathematics, in some kinds of science, when Europe was in the Dark Ages. And Rome took over Greek philosophy and Greek science, and for their time, they certainly had that, for some period of time, a successful economy and successful military techniques. So Jews were living as tiny minorities under this variety of majority cultures. What ought one to expect under those conditions? Now, I want you to try an imaginative experiment. I'm not recommending this as a real situation, but just as an experiment. Imagine that you are a liberal historian, anthropologist. Again, I'm not recommending this. I'm just offering this as a kind of imagination. What would you expect to happen to small minorities scattered, no central place of worship, certainly no control from any central place, and they're subject to these different majority cultures? I think you would expect over time, let's say over 500 years, that they would assimilate, that a lot of their information would be lost, that they would come to adapt themselves to the lifestyle of the people they're living among for the sake of convenience, for the sake of acceptance, for the sake of economic advancement. So that you had Jews in Yemen for 1,500 years, the secular historians say. Our tradition puts them back much further, as I understand. You had Jews in Poland for 1,000 years. There should be very little left in common between them. And that is precisely what did not happen. The vast majority of beliefs, practices, holidays, texts remain common between them. That is, I think, a historical shock. It is not what you would expect to happen. There's an example of what I told you before, as was the ancient period, survival under conditions which should lead you to expect disintegration, disappearance. And it didn't happen. Now, as I mentioned last time, and I'll just remind you, someone said to me, why are you so impressed with the survival of the Jewish people as scattered minorities? Don't the Gypsies, the Romani peoples, give you another example of the same thing? They've been scattered minorities for approximately 1,000 years, and they have retained their identity. So I said, it's a very good question. I'll think about it, and I'll look it up. So I looked up their websites, and this is what I discovered. The Romani peoples do have an identity. They're in various places in Europe and North and South America. They definitely have a separate existence. They have no memory of their past. They don't know where they came from, how they got there, what their origins are. None. They have no Romani religion. If they live in a Roman Catholic country, they become Roman Catholics. They live in an Eastern Orthodox country, they become Eastern Orthodox. They live in a Protestant country, they become Protestants. They live in a Muslim country, they become Muslims. As Romanis, they have no religion. They disagree on fundamental values. There are Romani groups that are against literacy. In principle, they do not learn to read and write, and other groups do. So much so that if you look up their websites, and I recommend you do this, if you look up their websites, they say one shouldn't speak of Romani culture, singular. One should speak of Romani cultures, because there are so many differences. What do they, yes, have in common? A certain physical form because they marry among their own, a certain dialect that they speak, and certain common superstitions. That's it. So having done this background, I wrote back to the fellow who sent me the example and thanked him. And I said, look, it's a very good example. They prove my point. This is what happened to scattered minorities in 1,000 years. What happened was they lost almost all of their culture. They have no history, no religion, differences of fundamental values. They don't know who they are. Whereas we, in 2,000 years as scattered minorities, we have a continuous history. We know exactly who we are. We have one religion and one religion in common. We share all the same values. There are differences. If I put round numbers on it, they lost 90% and we preserved 90%. So I think the Romanis are an example of what you should expect. And that makes it even harder to understand why that didn't happen to us. Yeah.
Were we persecuted during this time, or were we accepted into this society?
It was various. Some places one way and some places the other way. We'll talk about persecution. Persecution is the first proposed explanation of survival, which we will talk about. And that is refuted in spades. There's so many refutations, I can't even see them in the clouds after I get finished. You'll see. That's the worst one of all. But it's natural, it's intuitive, so I will talk about it. Anyway, also, during the second period, I have to restrain myself and not call it modern. During the second period, there were cultural experiments. Two famous ones, the Marranos and the Karaites. The Karaites started in maybe the 8th century or the 9th century, and they existed in Islamic lands, and they denied the oral tradition. At least that's the theme. They denied the oral tradition. They set up their own yeshivas. They had their own books, some of which exist. We can study them today. Because they emphasized the written, they were very, very good at the written, and they had big polemics with the Christians. And some of their arguments against the Christians are very clever. So I asked the Shiloh when I was much younger whether it's okay to read their books against the Christians. He said, yes, you can read them. At any rate, they flourished till about the 16th century. Since then, they've been in decline. You can look them up on the web. Last time I looked them up, there are about 35,000 Karaites left worldwide. There are no main training centers, and they're scattered. They don't have any central control, and they're on the way out. Marranos are also a very interesting case. The Inquisition gave Jews an opportunity to either convert, die, or leave. Many left. Hundreds of thousands left Spain and Portugal. Some pretended to convert. They lived as Christians in public, and they lived as Jews as best they could, privately, secretly. That's not permissible. It's not permissible to announce yourself as having a different religious identity. So this counts as a change in the classical Jewish formula. They disappeared. Just about. Someone told me once that there's still some secret society of a few hundred here and there who pretend to be Christians but still hold themselves to be Jews, but they have disappeared. And they have left interesting traces. There are some Spanish Catholics, and even more Portuguese Catholics, with funny customs. Some of them light candles in the basement Friday night. Ask them, why do you do that? It's a custom in the family. That's what we do. We light candles in the basement Friday night. Or they kiss door jambs. Walk out the door, they give it a kiss. Why do you do that? In our family, that's what we do. So we know what they're doing. You know, they're lighting the candles Friday night for Shabbos, and they're kissing the mezuzah. They don't know that. They're all Catholics. They're believing Catholics. They just have these funny customs. These were two large-scale experiments in Jewish identity, changing the traditional formula, and both of them have failed. So that feature you have also in the second period as well. This idea of modifying the formula and then finding that historically it's not viable. These are the facts that have to be explained. Okay, let's start with his example and play it through. Persecution. We were persecuted, and persecuted people stiffen their necks and they say, you want us to disappear? You just watch. You just watch. Disappear, we're going to outbreed you, and we're going to outthink you, and we're going to outcompete you. We're going to survive because you want us to disappear. It's the explanation of spite, right? Survival out of spite, which implies if you're nice to these people, they'll just obligingly disappear. But if you treat them badly, they're going to get you, they're going to survive. Let's see how it fits the facts. First of all, it doesn't obviously fit the first 1,000 years, where we have our own country and our own government and our own economics and our own army and our own majority population. It doesn't explain the survival for those 1,000 years that we were subject to persecution. It simply didn't exist for that 1,000 years. That's number one. Number two, remember what we're trying to explain. We're trying to explain why we survived and everybody else disappeared. If all the ancient cultures had survived, there'd be nothing to explain. They all survived. No, we survived and the other ones disappeared. So the question you ought to ask now is, those that disappeared, were they persecuted? We're looking at persecution as an engine of survival, something that promotes survival. So let's look at persecution where it exists and see if it does that job. Were other ancient cultures persecuted? You bet. When Rome became Christian, it was forbidden to be anything but a Christian. And they went out with their legionnaires to make sure that you're going to be Christian. What happened to all those cultures, all those religions in all of Europe that existed? They disappeared. The Muslims weren't quite as brutal, but pretty close. According to strict Islam, this is important for current events as well. According to strict Islam, there are three groups of people. There are Muslims, other monotheists, and non-monotheists. Non-monotheists are convert or die. We don't tolerate non-monotheists. Monotheists can be tolerated, but they have to be second-class citizens. No state. The United States of America is an illegitimate state, according to Islam. Any non-Muslim state is illegitimate. Second-class status, special taxes, identification. The Jewish star was invented by the Muslims. Christians took it over. So, Islam conquered North Africa, and it conquered all of the Arabian Peninsula, as I told you. Right? And all those cultures disappeared. Were they persecuted? In spades they were persecuted, and they all disappeared. So it looks like persecution is pretty good at wiping out cultures. Even with respect to us, if you look at the Jewish population in Russia at 1900, that's before the USSR, the Jewish population was about 3 million. 2.5 to 3 million identified Jews. Not all of them were religious, but they were identified Jews. There was Yiddish theater and Yiddish newspapers and agriculture and literature and proto-Zionist groups. And 100 years later, maybe 250,000. 90% were lost. Their identity was lost. In less than 100 years, Soviet Union practiced systematic persecution of Jews, among others. They persecuted a lot of people, but they persecuted us. And in 70 years of the existence of the USSR, 90% was lost. So persecution works pretty well against us. Furthermore, let's take a look at the United States of America. The last 120 years, the United States has been the most tolerant, accepting, more than that, friendly, promoting environment that the Jewish people has had in 2,000 years of exile. And I tell you as a footnote, we should be grateful for that, and we should express our gratitude for that. Just compare contemporary America with Europe. Now, according to this model, that it is persecution that produces Jewish survival, what does this model predict when there isn't persecution? What does it predict when the larger society accepts you and befriends you for decades and decades? In the winter season, in December, many places in the United States have the sign, Season's Greetings. You know why? Because 2% are celebrating Hanukkah, that's why. So 98% don't say Merry Christmas. Because 2% are celebrating Hanukkah. That's amazing. So this model that persecution produces Jewish survival, what does it predict in a situation like the United States? It predicts a collapse of Jewish identity. Now let's see what's happening in this test case. Well, it's true. The Jews from the center and left are collapsing. Their intermarriage rate is 3/4, and their identification rate is next to zero. Now, I'm just going to add a little footnote here. When you talk about identification, don't talk about how many synagogue members they have. That can be an artificial figure. For example, in maybe all, or certainly the majority of Reform synagogues in the United States, you can't have a bar or bat mitzvah for your child unless you are a paid member for 2 years prior. So the family makes the following calculation. Having the bar or bat mitzvah in the synagogue premises costs 10% of what it would cost if I hired a real hall. How much does it cost to be a member for 2 years? 20% of the cost? I'm 70% ahead. For sure. Why not? They never come on Friday night. They never come on Saturday morning or Sunday morning. They just do it as an economic. That kind of membership shouldn't be counted as part of the identification of that movement. That's just an economic ploy, and they know it. So the vast majority of the center and left are assimilating out. That's true. What about the right? The right is exploding in size. That's not predicted by the model. In fact, there was a census done in 1990. It was repeated in 2000. And the same projection was made. This is famous. Alan Dershowitz made this famous in his book, The Disappearance of the American Jew, by which, by the way, he meant, I got this wrong for a couple of years till somebody set me straight. By the disappearance of the American Jew, he meant the disappearance of the American-style Jew. Our group in America is flourishing in America. I wondered why he was oblivious to us. He wasn't talking about us. He wasn't talking about Jews in America. He's talking the American-style Jew, his style of Jew. They did a projection. Take 200 people, 200 Jews identified with one of several groups, project 4 generations hence, how many will there be? So the projection went like this. 200 unaffiliated, 4 generations hence, there'll be 7. 200 Reform, 17. 200 Conservative, 75. 200 Modern Orthodox, 600. Now, I'm glad you're sitting down. 200 Ultra-Orthodox, 5,000. 5,000. That's what they projected. The model of persecution doesn't predict that. Doesn't predict that. So it seems to me, the model of persecution, sorry, the model of persecution doesn't predict that. It seems to me that if you're going to measure persecution as a model for Jewish survival against the facts, you get a colossal failure. Colossal. Fails across the board. Yeah.
You see 2 points on that. The obviously, like the American explosion of orthodoxy is obviously helped massively by like the Baal Teshuvah movement in Israel and stuff like that. So if it wasn't for these yeshivas then helping thousands of people become orthodox, like you wouldn't have as much push on the other side.
There's no question that the Baal Teshuvah movement is an aid. The Baal Teshuvah movement started in numbers around 1965. The explosion in the population goes back to 1930. In 1930, the number of religious day schools in America was 50. By 1960, it was something like 300, and today it's over 1,000. So the expansion of the population has been going on long before the Baal Teshuvah movement. That's one. And number two, you can take a look at the birth rate plus the fall-off rate and ask yourself, it's very interesting, the people who did this population survey take into account reproduction and intermarriage. So they write in a footnote, we don't have intermarriage statistics for the ultra-Orthodox, so we arbitrarily set the rate at 3%. 3% intermarriage. That's just, that's phantasmagoria. That's ridiculous. It's now 0.01%. It's, intermarriage? I don't know. All my 40 years, practicing 45 years, I never heard of a single one. I lived in different places in the world, different communities. I've never heard of a single intermarriage, not one. So it's just non-existent. So that even their projections are slanted against the reality. Yes, the Baal Tshuva movement has played a role, but not that significant a role. The estimates of the number of Baalei Tshuva vary from what I've seen between 250,000 up to 400,000.
That's huge.
Not huge against a population that started after the war and has grown to a worldwide population of 3 million.
Yeah, but with how many children we have, like within, it's like
Even so, it's 10%.
one generation.
You're talking about 10%. Talking about no more than 10%. 10% addition does not make a population. Right? You need
million could become like 15 million within a couple of generations.
try the math. Doesn't work that way. Yeah.
So then, what would the graph say about groups that haven't been persecuted? Because I guess it's a two-part question. Because then, in the case of like Muslims or Christians, how have they seen trends for people becoming more observant in those faiths or not? In today's
Look, you see, you're making a very interesting intellectual move here, and I think we have to sort of draw contours around what we're saying. We're testing a theory that A causes B, and I'm giving you counterexamples where when you have A, you don't have B. Now somebody says, "What happens when you don't have A?" I don't know. I'm testing a theory that says that A causes B. We don't have A, you might have B, you might not have B.